A chance encounter. Officer Luke Evans had been a cop for nearly 2 decades, and in that time, he had seen a lot. Too much, in fact. His once hopeful view of the world had hardened over the years, replaced by a cynical acceptance of the darkness people were capable of. Each shift was a cycle of routine patrols, paperwork, and the occasional call that reminded him of just how broken the world was. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The air was cold, carrying the crisp bite of autumn, as Luke drove slowly through the quiet streets of Greenfield, a small suburban town that sat just outside the bustling city. His headlights illuminated the empty sidewalks and the occasional stray cat darting across the road. It was peaceful, in a way that made Luke uneasy. He had learned the hard way that calm nights often hid deeper troubles. As he turned a corner near Willow Park, his eyes instinctively scanned the playground. He had been through here earlier in the evening and noted nothing unusual, but now, in the dim glow of the streetlights, he spotted something that made him slow his cruiser to a stop. A small figure sat curled up at the base of a slide, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Luke frowned. It wasn't the first time he had encountered kids hanging out past curfew, but something about this scene felt different. There was no laughter, no signs of mischief, just a stillness that sent a wave of concern through him. With a sigh, he put the car in park and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he approached. "Hey there," he called out, keeping his voice even and non-threatening. "It's late. What are you doing out here all alone?" The figure stirred slightly, revealing a young girl, no older than 9 or 10. She had dark, curly hair pulled back into small braids, her wide brown eyes blinking up at him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Her clothes, worn jeans, and an oversized hoodie, were rumpled, and her small sneakers were scuffed and dirty. She didn't answer. Luke crouched down to her level, careful not to invade her space. "My name's Officer Luke. What's your name?" She hesitated before murmuring, "Leah." "Leah," he repeated with a small nod. "That's a pretty name. Where are your parents? Do they know you're out here?" Leah's gaze dropped to the ground. "My mom's not here." Luke felt his stomach tighten. "Okay, where do you live?" Again, she hesitated, biting her lip. "Here," she whispered. Luke blinked. "You mean in the neighborhood?" Leah shook her head and gestured vaguely around the playground. "Here." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy stone. She was homeless. Luke took a slow breath, choosing his next words carefully. "Leah, how long have you been staying here?" She fidgeted, tugging at the sleeves of her hoodie. "A few days, maybe more." Luke's chest ached at the quiet resignation in her voice. No child should be sleeping in a playground, especially as the nights grew colder. "Where's your mom?" he asked gently. Leah hesitated again before answering. "She went to find a job. She said she'd be back soon." The waver in her voice told him she wasn't sure if that was true. "How long ago did she leave?" he pressed. Leah sniffled, hugging her knees tighter. "I dunno. A week. She said it wouldn't take long." A week. Luke clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. He had seen situations like this before. Single parents struggling to keep their heads above water, some making desperate choices to survive. But abandoning a child, that was a different level of desperation. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. She shrugged. "Had some crackers earlier." Luke exhaled sharply through his nose, his heart twisting at her nonchalance. He stood up and extended a hand. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Leah hesitated, eyeing his outstretched hand warily. "But what if my mom comes back and I'm not here?" Luke softened his tone. "If she comes looking for you, we'll make sure she knows where to find you. But right now, you need food, and you need a safe place to sleep. You can't stay out here, sweetheart. It's getting too cold." Leah chewed her lip, uncertainty flashing across her face. But after a moment, she reached out and placed her small hand in his. Luke felt something stir inside him, something unfamiliar, a deep protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long time. He led her to the patrol car, opening the passenger door for her. "Hop in. I'll take you to the station. We'll find you a warm bed for the night." "Okay." She climbed in hesitantly, her tiny frame swallowed by the seat. As Luke drove, he kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She stared out the window, her fingers gripping the seatbelt tightly. When they arrived at the station, he guided her inside, past curious glances from his fellow officers. He led her to an empty break room, grabbed a blanket from the supply closet, and draped it over her shoulders. "Wait here," he told her. "I'm going to get you something to eat." Leah nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. As he stepped out of the room, Officer Daniels, his longtime partner, raised an eyebrow. "What's the story?" Luke exhaled heavily. "Little girl, maybe 10. Been living at the playground for a week. Mom's missing." Daniels let out a low whistle. "Dan, that's rough." Luke nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I need to make some calls, see if we can track down the mother." Daniels clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You got this, man." Luke nodded absently, already focused on the task ahead. An hour later, after a warm meal and a cup of hot cocoa, Leah had begun to relax, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. Luke watched her from his desk, his chest tightening. This wasn't just another case. It felt personal, and he had no intention of letting her slip through the cracks. As he picked up the phone to start his search for her mother, he made a silent promise to Leah. He would find out what happened, and he wouldn't stop until she was safe. A broken promise. Leah sat curled up on the old leather couch in the station's break room, the weight of the warm blanket over her shoulders barely making a dent in the exhaustion she felt. The sandwich and hot cocoa Luke had given her were the most she had eaten in days, but even with the warmth of the station around her, a deep sense of loneliness still clung to her like a shadow. She kept glancing toward the door, half expecting her mother to walk in at any moment, apologizing for taking so long, promising everything would be okay. But deep down, Leah wasn't sure she believed that anymore. Across the hall, Luke sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. He had already called the local shelters, the hospitals, even the county jail, anywhere a desperate woman might have ended up. No sign of Nicole Thompson. His gut tightened. A mother doesn't just leave her kid at a playground for over a week without checking in. Something was wrong. And he was going to find out what. The search begins. Luke leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as Officer Daniels walked over, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Anything?" Daniels asked, sliding into the chair across from him. Luke shook his head. "Nothing. No records of her being picked up, no sign of her at any shelters. It's like she vanished." Daniels took a sip of his coffee, his brow furrowed. "You think she just bailed?" Luke glanced through the glass window into the break room. Leah had finally dozed off, the exhaustion overtaking her. Her tiny frame seemed even smaller under the heavy fabric of the blanket. "No," Luke said firmly. "She wouldn't just leave her daughter like that." Daniels arched a skeptical brow. "Happens more than you think, man." Luke's jaw clenched. Not this time. He turned back to his desk and pulled up Nicole's records. There wasn't much. No criminal history, no recent address, just an old apartment lease that had ended 3 months ago. She had been working at a local diner, according to an employment record, so Luke grabbed his coat. "I'm gonna check out her last job," he said, already heading for the door. Daniels exhaled heavily. "You're getting too deep into this, Luke." Luke ignored him. He wasn't just doing this for Leah. Something about this case felt different, and he needed answers, clues, and dead ends. The diner was one of those small, run-down places that sat on the outskirts of town. The kind of place truckers and night shift workers passed through on their way to somewhere else. A tired-looking waitress with graying hair and a cigarette tucked behind her ear glanced up as Luke walked in. "Help you, officer?" she asked, setting down a tray of coffee cups. Luke pulled out his badge. I'm looking for information on one of your former employees, Nicole Thompson. The woman's face scrunched up in thought. Nicole. Oh yeah, she worked here for a while, but she stopped showing up about a month ago. Boss let her go. She in trouble. Luke shook his head. Just trying to find her. Do you remember anything unusual before she disappeared? The waitress leaned against the counter, thinking. She was real quiet, kept to herself. But I do remember she seemed real worried about something near the end. Kept looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was following her. Luke frowned. Did she ever mention who? The woman shrugged. Not to me. But there was this one night, maybe a week before she stopped coming in. Some guy showed up looking for her. Creepy-looking fella. Gave me a bad feeling. Luke's interest piqued. Did you get a name? She shook her head. Nope, but he wasn't the type you forget easy. Tall, real thin, had this nasty scar across his jaw. When I told him Nicole wasn't working that night, he just stared at me for a long minute, then walked out without a word. Luke jotted down the description in his notebook. Did Nicole ever mention him to you? Not really, the waitress said. But the next day, she was even jumpier than usual. After that, she stopped showing up altogether. Luke nodded, slipping his notebook back into his pocket. Thanks for your time. As he stepped out of the diner, a chill ran down his spine. Someone had been looking for Nicole. And whatever had happened to her, she had been afraid. A promise to keep. Back at the station, Leah was awake when Luke returned. She sat cross-legged on the couch, staring down at the laces of her sneakers, fiddling with the ends. Did you find her? She asked quietly. Luke sighed and sat down across from her. Not yet, but I'm not giving up. Leah's eyes searched his face, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. My mom always keeps her promises, she murmured. She promised she'd come back. Luke felt his chest tighten. He had seen that kind of hope before. The kind that clung to the thinnest thread, refusing to break, even when the world said otherwise. He couldn't take that hope away from her. Then we're going to find out what happened, he said firmly. For the first time since he had met her, Leah gave him a small, hesitant smile. Luke exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. Nicole had vanished. A man with a scar had been looking for her, and now her little girl was left alone, waiting for a promise that might never be kept. But Luke wasn't going to let her wait forever. He was going to find Nicole, no matter what it took. The man with the scar. Luke sat at his desk, staring at the sparse details in Nicole Thompson's file. It didn't make sense. She had no history of crime, no record of substance abuse, no known enemies, just a struggling single mother trying to make ends meet. Yet, she had disappeared without a trace. And now, there was this man with the scar, a shadowy figure lurking around just before Nicole vanished. Luke tapped his pen against his notepad, thinking. He needed more information. He needed to find that man. A terrified witness. Luke's first stop was Nicole's former apartment complex, a rundown, low-income housing unit on the edge of town. The kind of place where tenants came and went, and people minded their own business. He knocked on the door of apartment 2B, the last address listed under Nicole's name. No answer. He knocked again, this time more firmly. After a moment, an old woman cracked the door open, peering at him through tired, suspicious eyes. You ain't the landlord, so what do you want? Luke showed his badge. I'm looking for Nicole Thompson. I was told she used to live here. The old woman scoffed. Used to, but she left weeks ago. Packed up in the middle of the night. Real sudden-like. Luke's pulse quickened. Did she say where she was going? The woman shook her head. Nope. Just left with her little girl. That poor kid. Sweet thing. Always said hello when I saw her. Did you notice anything strange before she left? The woman hesitated, her fingers tightening on the doorknob. Maybe. Luke waited. The old woman glanced up and down the hallway before opening the door wider. There was this man. Came around a few times, asking for her, gave me the creeps. Luke pulled out his notepad. Did he have a scar on his face? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah, big one. Ran down his jaw like someone took a knife to him. Luke felt his stomach tighten. Did he threaten her? I don't know, the woman admitted. But one night, I heard her yelling through the walls. Heard a man's voice too. She sounded scared. Luke's jaw clenched. Did you ever see him again after that? The woman nodded. A few nights later, after she was gone, I saw him standing outside the building, just watching her window. I called the cops, but by the time they got here, he was gone. Luke jotted everything down, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. Nicole had been running from someone, and now she was gone. The dark past of Nicole Thompson. Back at the station, Luke dug deeper into Nicole's history. There was nothing criminal in her past, but when he pulled her records from a different state, something jumped out at him. A restraining order, issued 4 years ago against a man named Derek Kane. Luke's pulse quickened as he read through the documents. Nicole had filed the order in Ohio, detailing years of harassment and threats from Kane, a former boyfriend. He had been abusive, controlling, and had refused to let her go when she tried to leave him. She had fled, changed her number, and moved to a different state to escape him. But now it looked like he had found her. Luke swore under his breath. Derek Kane had a scar on his jaw. He had no proof yet, but it was becoming clear. Nicole hadn't just left Leah behind. She had been taken. Leah's fading hope. Leah sat in the break room, her fingers toying with the stuffed teddy bear Luke had given her. She had been at the station for 2 days now, and though she was being looked after, the worry in her eyes never faded. Luke entered with a cup of hot cocoa, setting it down beside her. "You doing okay, kiddo?" he asked gently. Leah nodded, but it was a small, hesitant movement. "Did you find my mom yet?" Luke crouched down to her level. He hated not having good news for her. "Not yet, but I'm getting closer. I promise." Leah's small fingers clenched the teddy bear tighter. "She wouldn't leave me." "I know," Luke said, his voice firm. "That's why I won't stop looking." Leah looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with trust. "You promise?" Luke swallowed past the tightness in his chest. "With all my heart." She nodded, but Luke could see the exhaustion in her face. She was holding on to hope, and he couldn't let her down. Hunting a ghost. Luke ran a search on Derek Kane. He had no current address, no listed job, and no known relatives in the state. He was a ghost, but ghosts leave traces. Luke contacted the police department in Ohio that had handled Nicole's restraining order. After some digging, they found an old arrest record. Derek had been picked up for assault 3 years ago, but had disappeared after making bail. There was also something else, a recent credit card charge, a cheap motel 30 miles outside of town. Luke's heart pounded. That was it. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He had a predator to find. The motel on the edge of nowhere. The motel was the kind of place you didn't stay in unless you were desperate. Paint peeling off the walls, flickering neon signs, and an air of quiet neglect. Luke pulled his cruiser into the lot and killed the engine, scanning the rows of rusted cars for something that stood out. There, a black sedan, its license plates half covered with mud. Luke stepped out of the car, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun as he approached the motel office. The clerk barely looked up from his newspaper when Luke flashed his badge. "Looking for a guy named Derek Kane. He's staying here." The clerk frowned but checked the system. "Room 17. Checked in 3 nights ago." Luke's pulse thrummed. He stepped back outside, his heart pounding. Room 17 was at the far end of the lot. Luke approached carefully, his other hand now hovering over his weapon. He could feel the tension in the air. Then, a noise from inside. A muffled voice. A woman's voice. Nicole. Luke didn't hesitate. He raised his fist and pounded on the door. Derek Kane, open up. Silence. Luke pulled his gun. You have 5 seconds to open this door before I break it down. No response. Luke's jaw clenched. He took a step back, and then he kicked the door open. The lock snapped. The door swung inward, and there she was, Nicole, bound to a chair, her wrists bruised, a strip of duct tape over her mouth. And standing behind her, Derek Kane, scarred jaw, wild eyes, a knife glinting in his hand. Luke didn't hesitate. Drop the weapon. Hands where I can see them. Derek's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. There wasn't one. She's mine, Derek snarled. She belongs to me. Luke's finger hovered over the trigger. Not anymore. Nicole's eyes filled with tears. Leah's mother had been found. But this wasn't over yet. The standoff. The room was suffocating with tension. Luke stood firm, his gun trained on Derek Kane, the man who had spent years tormenting Nicole and had now taken her captive. His scared jaw twitched, his grip on the knife tightening as his wild, unblinking eyes flicked from Luke to Nicole. Nicole sat bound to the chair, her face bruised, her lips split. Her wrists were raw from the rope digging into her skin. Her panicked eyes met Luke's, silently pleading for help. Luke kept his stance steady. You've got one chance, Kane. Drop the knife. Step away. Derek let out a twisted laugh. You think I'm just gonna let her walk out of here? Luke's finger hovered over the trigger. She's not yours. She never was. This ends now. Derek's expression twisted into something ugly. You don't get it, do you? She ran from me. She's mine. She owes me. Luke felt a deep rage coil in his chest. He had seen men like Kane before. Controlling, violent, convinced that their victims belonged to them. And he had seen too many women pay the price for escaping too late. Not this time. You don't own anyone, Kane. And if you make one wrong move, I'll put you down before you can even blink. Derek sneered, his grip on the knife twitching. I could kill her right now, you know, before you even get a shot off. Luke's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He couldn't afford to let this man control the situation. He needed to take back the upper hand. He took a slow step forward, keeping his gun steady. You've already lost, Kane. We've got your name, your face, your location. There's no getting out of this. Drop the knife, and maybe, just maybe, you won't spend the rest of your life rotting in a cell. Derek hesitated. Luke saw the flicker of doubt. Last chance, Luke warned. Put the knife down. Now. For a brief second, it looked like Derek might surrender. His grip loosened. Then, he lunged. A single shot. Luke's instincts took over. His fingers squeezed the trigger before Derek could even get close to Nicole. The gunshot exploded in the small room. Derek stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide with shock. The knife clattered to the ground, bouncing once before settling near Nicole's chair. Luke moved fast, kicking the knife away before Derek could even think about reaching for it. Derek let out a strangled howl of pain, his hand trembling as blood seeped through his fingers. You shot me. Luke holstered his gun and grabbed his radio. Suspect down. I need paramedics at the Sunset Motel, room 17. Female victim recovered. Nicole was shaking violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Luke knelt beside her, his hands moving quickly to untie the ropes cutting into her wrists. Nicole, he said softly, it's over. You're safe now. Her breath hitched as her free hands immediately flew to cover her mouth, tears streaming down her bruised face. He wasn't going to let me go, she choked out. He was going to. She couldn't even finish the sentence. Luke's jaw clenched as he helped her out of the chair. You don't have to be afraid anymore. He's not going to hurt you again. Derek groaned from the floor, his body writhing as he clutched his wounded shoulder. She was mine. He spat weakly, still clinging to his delusions. Luke ignored him. Nicole collapsed against his chest, her entire body trembling. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, feeling the way her shoulders shook as she sobbed. "Shay," he murmured, "you're okay now. You're going home." For the first time, in a long time, she believed him. A mother's return. By the time Luke pulled up outside the social services center later that evening, his heart felt like it had been through a war. Nicole sat beside him in the passenger seat, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. "What if," she swallowed hard, "what if she's mad at me?" Luke turned to her. "Leah loves you. She's been waiting for you." Nicole nodded, but the guilt in her eyes didn't fade. When Luke led her inside, Leah was sitting at the far end of the playroom, clutching the same stuffed bear she had been holding since she arrived. She was staring at the floor, her small body stiff. She didn't look up right away. Nicole let out a shaky breath. "Leah?" At the sound of her mother's voice, Leah's head snapped up. Her eyes widened. Then, she launched herself forward. "Mommy." Nicole dropped to her knees, catching her daughter as Leah threw her arms around her neck, sobbing so hard her tiny body shook. "I missed you so much," Leah cried, clutching her like she would never let go again. Nicole broke down completely, her hands cradling Leah's face, kissing her forehead over and over. "I'm so sorry, baby. I never wanted to leave you. I love you so much." Luke turned away, swallowing past the lump in his throat. He had done a lot in his years as a cop, but this, bringing a mother and daughter back together, felt like one of the most important things he had ever done. More than just a cop. Over the next few weeks, Luke didn't just disappear after reuniting Nicole and Leah. He helped them. He got them placed in a safe housing program, made sure Nicole got access to therapy, and even pulled some strings to help her get a new job. He visited them every single day, bringing small gifts for Leah, groceries for Nicole, and making sure they knew they weren't alone. Then, one evening, as he sat in their new apartment, Leah climbed onto the couch beside him and leaned her head against his arm. "Officer Luke?" she asked softly. "Yeah, kiddo." Leah was quiet for a long moment. Then, in the smallest voice, she whispered, "Can I call you Dad?" Luke's breath hitched. His throat tightened. He looked over at Nicole, who had tears in her eyes, her expression soft, as if she already knew what his answer would be. Luke swallowed hard. "Yeah, sweetheart, you can." Leah's smile was the brightest thing in the world. And for the first time in a long time, Luke realized he wasn't just a cop anymore. He was part of a family. A new beginning. The weight of Leah's words settled over Luke like a warm embrace. "Can I call you Dad?" He had never been the sentimental type. Years on the force had hardened him, taught him to keep his emotions in check, to not get too involved. But with Leah, with Nicole, something had shifted. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was family. Luke gently placed a hand on Leah's small shoulder. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You can." Leah beamed, her tiny arms wrapping around his waist in a tight hug. Luke hesitated for just a second before embracing her back, his large hands resting protectively on her back. From across the room, Nicole watched with tears in her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped them away. She had been running for so long, running from fear, from pain, from the nightmare that was Derek Kane. But for the first time in years, she felt safe. She had a home. And someone she could trust. Someone who had gone to the ends of the earth to bring her back to her daughter. Luke looked up and met Nicole's gaze. There was a moment of silent understanding between them. No words were needed. The road to healing. The next few weeks passed in a blur of small victories and long nights. Nicole and Leah had been placed in a safe housing program through social services, and Luke had made sure Nicole had around-the-clock protection until Derek Kane was officially charged and sentenced. The case against Derek was solid. Kidnapping, aggravated assault, violating a restraining order. He wouldn't be seeing freedom for a long, long time. But even with Derek out of the picture, Nicole still carried the weight of fear on her shoulders. She had spent so many years looking over her shoulder that relaxing felt unnatural. Luke saw it in the way she flinched at sudden noises, how she still hesitated before answering the phone, how her hands sometimes shook when she tucked Leah into bed. One evening, as they sat together in their small apartment, Nicole on the couch, Luke on the armrest, Leah asleep in the next room, Nicole let out a quiet sigh. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted softly, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "How to feel normal again." Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's going to take time," he said. "You don't just wake up one day and stop being afraid." Nicole swallowed, her fingers tightening around the fabric in her lap. "What if I never stop?" Luke turned to face her fully, his voice gentle but firm. "You will. Not because it'll be easy, but because you're stronger than what happened to you." Nicole gave a shaky laugh. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to," Luke said. "You just have to keep going, and you don't have to do it alone." Nicole glanced at him then, searching his face. There was something in his eyes, steady, unwavering, real. It had been a long time since she had met a man she could trust. And Luke. Luke had done more for her and Leah in the past few weeks than anyone had in years. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wanted him in their lives. Christmas miracles. By the time December rolled around, Nicole and Leah's apartment had started to feel like a real home. Luke had helped them set up furniture, introduced them to kind neighbors, and even convinced the local diner to give Nicole a part-time job until she could get back on her feet. One evening, as Luke stopped by after his shift, he found Leah waiting for him on the front porch, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. "Officer Luke," she called, running up to him. Luke grinned, catching her as she jumped into his arms. "Hey, kiddo. What's all this energy for?" Leah wiggled excitedly. "Mom said we're getting a Christmas tree tomorrow. A real one. Can you come with us?" Luke chuckled, setting her down. "A real one, huh? That sounds like a lot of work." Leah pouted. "Please? It won't be the same without you." Luke glanced up at Nicole, who stood in the doorway, smiling softly. "Yeah," she said. "You should come." Luke felt his chest warm. He nodded. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The next evening, they made their way to a small Christmas tree farm just outside of town. Leah ran between the rows of trees, shouting for Luke and Nicole to come look at her favorites. "This one," she cried, hugging a tree that was way too big for their apartment. Luke crossed his arms, smirking. "You planning on putting that thing in your pocket?" Leah giggled. "Fine. What about this one?" Nicole smiled. "That one's perfect." Luke knelt beside Leah, brushing some snow off her nose. "You ready to carry it?" Leah gave him a deadpan look. "I'm 9. Excuses, excuses," Luke teased, picking up the small tree himself and hoisting it over his shoulder. Nicole laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "That's what they tell me," Luke said with a grin. That night, they decorated the tree together. Leah placed the star on top while Luke held her steady on his shoulders. Nicole made hot chocolate, and for the first time in years, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heater. It was family warmth, and she never wanted to lose it. A Christmas wish. On Christmas Eve, Luke arrived at their apartment with a box of gifts tucked under his arm. "You didn't have to do that," Nicole said as he set them under the tree. Luke shrugged. Santa needed a little help this year. Leah sat cross-legged in front of the tree, carefully inspecting the gifts. "Can we open one now?" Nicole smiled. "Just one." Leah ripped into the wrapping paper and gasped. It was a framed photo of the three of them at the Christmas tree farm, laughing. Nicole's breath hitched. She hadn't realized Luke had taken it. Leah hugged the frame to her chest. "This is the best present ever." Luke's heart ached in the best way possible. Nicole looked at him, eyes shining. "Thank you, Luke, for everything." Luke smiled. "Wouldn't be Christmas without you too." That night, as Leah slept under the glow of the tree, Nicole and Luke sat on the couch, a comfortable silence between them. Nicole turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Luke, can I ask you something?" He looked at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "Anything." Nicole hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Would you ever consider staying?" Luke's heart stopped. He studied her, the way her fingers fidgeted slightly, the vulnerability in her voice. She wasn't just asking about tonight. She was asking about forever. Luke reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "I already have." Nicole's breath hitched. Then, slowly, she smiled. For the first time in years, she knew what it felt like to be home. And this time, she wasn't alone. Shadows of the past. Luke had always thought of himself as a man who kept his emotions in check, but this Christmas had changed something inside him. Sitting in Nicole's warm apartment, with the soft glow of the Christmas tree illuminating the room, he realized how much had shifted in just a few months. He wasn't just a cop trying to close a case anymore. He was part of something bigger, a family. And for the first time in a long time, that terrified him. The weight of a promise. Nicole noticed the way Luke seemed quieter than usual, his gaze distant as he stared at the twinkling lights. "Luke," she asked softly, nudging his arm. "Are you okay?" Luke blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. "Yeah, just thinking." Nicole tilted her head, studying him. "About what?" He hesitated. How could he tell her that after all these years of working alone, keeping his distance, never letting anyone in, he was afraid of how much he cared about her and Leah? Instead, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just everything. Making sure you two are safe. Making sure that no one ever comes after you again." Nicole's expression softened. She reached out and placed a gentle hand over his own. "Luke, you've already done so much for us. You don't have to carry this burden alone." He exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to do anything else." Nicole squeezed his hand. "Then maybe it's time to learn." Luke let out a breathless chuckle. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," she admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm doing this alone. And I don't want you to feel that way either." Luke looked at her then, really looked at her. And for the first time since he had met her, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The unfinished business. Despite the warmth of the holidays, there was still one lingering weight on Luke's shoulders. Derek Kane. Yes, the man was locked up, awaiting trial. But Luke knew men like him. They didn't forget. They didn't forgive. And worst of all, they didn't let go. So Luke did what he did best. He investigated. Over the next few weeks, he dug deeper into Derek's past, his associates, his family, anything that might pose a threat to Nicole and Leah. And what he found made his stomach turn. Derek had ties to something bigger. A small but dangerous criminal network that operated across multiple states, trafficking, extortion, money laundering. Nicole had always thought she was running from one man. But Luke was starting to think that she had been running from something much bigger, the threat that lurks. One night, long after Leah had fallen asleep and Nicole had gone to bed, Luke sat at the kitchen table, files and reports spread out in front of him. The deeper he dug, the more uneasy he felt. There were mentions of Derek Kane in old police reports, but not just for domestic violence. There were whispers of connections to bigger players, people who had the resources to make problems disappear. If that was true, Nicole wasn't just running from Derek. She was running from everyone he was connected to. And even with Derek behind bars, those people might still be out there. Luke scrubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion creeping in. He needed more information. He needed to be sure. And more than anything, he needed to protect Nicole and Leah. Because if there was even a chance that someone else might come for them, Luke wasn't going to wait until it was too late. A late-night visitor. Luke finally allowed himself to doze off for a couple of hours, but something jerked him awake just before dawn. A noise, a soft knock at the door. His body immediately went on high alert. Nicole was still asleep, and Leah was curled up in her room. It was too early for a visitor, and no one who knew them would be coming by at this hour. Luke grabbed his gun, moving silently toward the door. He peered through the peephole, every muscle in his body tensing. A man stood outside. Not a neighbor, not a friend. Luke's pulse pounded in his ears. He recognized the man. It was one of Derek Kane's old associates, a low-level thug named Vince "Red" Walker, who had been mentioned in several of Derek's old police reports. Luke didn't hesitate. He unlocked the door and threw it open, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You have 5 seconds to explain what the hell you're doing here before I drag you down to the station," Luke growled, his grip tightening. Vince raised his hands in surrender, his face pale. "Whoa, whoa. I ain't here to start trouble, man." "Then why the hell are you knocking on this door at 5 in the morning?" Vince swallowed hard. I just came to warn you." Luke's grip didn't loosen. "Warn me about what?" Vince looked around nervously, as if making sure no one else was listening. "They ain't done," he muttered. "Derek might be locked up, but his friends, they don't like unfinished business." Luke's stomach dropped. Nicole and Leah were still in danger. And now, the clock was ticking. The storm ahead. Luke shoved Vince back, eyes locked on him. "Tell me everything." Vince licked his lips, clearly nervous. "Look, man, I ain't stupid. I don't want to end up in a ditch somewhere. But I know how these people work. Derek was just one piece of the puzzle, and when you took him down, you made some very bad people very angry." Luke's pulse pounded. He had suspected that Derek wasn't working alone, but now he had confirmation. And that meant Nicole and Leah were still at risk. Luke's mind was already racing through plans, strategies, ways to keep them safe. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. Derek Kane was gone. But the people he had been running with, they were still out there. And now, they had a new target. Nicole, Leah, and Luke himself. A silent decision. Luke watched as Vince hurried away, disappearing into the early morning mist. He closed the door quietly, taking a deep breath. Then he walked to Leah's room, where she was still fast asleep, her small hand clutching the teddy bear he had given her. Next, he went to Nicole's door. He didn't wake her, but he watched her for a long moment, making a silent vow. This wasn't just about protecting them anymore. It was about making sure they never had to run again. And if that meant facing whatever was coming head-on, Luke was ready. Because this wasn't just a case anymore. This was his family, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The final stand. Luke had been a cop long enough to know when a storm was brewing. And this storm was coming straight for Nicole and Leah. Derek Kane had been taken down, but the criminals he had been connected to, they weren't just going to forget about him. Men like that didn't let unfinished business slide. So Luke did what he did best. He prepared for war. A plan for survival. By the time the sun rose, Luke was already on the phone with his most trusted contacts in law enforcement. Nicole and Leah couldn't just wait around for danger to knock on their door. They needed protection. They needed a plan. Officer Daniels, his longtime partner, met him at a small diner that morning, stirring his coffee with a deep frown. "You really think they're coming?" Daniels asked. Luke nodded, his expression grim. Derek Kane wasn't just some lone wolf. His associates, they want payback. And Nicole and Leah are still targets. Daniels exhaled sharply. "Dan, you sure you don't want to put them in protective custody?" Luke hated that idea. Putting them in protective custody meant separating them, keeping them locked away like prisoners. Lee had already lost too much. He wasn't going to let her live in fear. There has to be another way, Luke muttered, rubbing his temples. Daniel studied him. You don't just care about protecting them, do you? Luke was silent for a long moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he admitted, they're my family. Daniels nodded slowly. Then we make sure they stay safe, no matter what. The first warning. It didn't take long for trouble to find them. That evening, as Luke pulled into Nicole's apartment complex, he noticed something that set off every alarm in his head. A black SUV was parked down the street, its engine idling. Not moving. Not leaving. Just watching. Luke clenched his jaw. The message was clear. We're watching you. He parked fast, jumping out of his cruiser and making his way toward the SUV with slow, measured steps. His gun rested on his hip, ready to be drawn. The windows were tinted, but Luke could make out two figures inside. He knocked on the driver's side window. No response. Knocked again, harder. Still nothing. His patience snapped. You're either going to roll this window down, or I'm gonna have this vehicle impounded in the next 60 seconds. The window rolled down just an inch, revealing a pair of cold, calculating eyes. The man behind the wheel smirked. Relax, officer. Just out for a drive. Luke's fingers twitched toward his gun. Yeah. Funny how your drive happens to stop right outside this apartment complex. The man shrugged. Nice neighborhood. Luke leaned in, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper. You listen to me, and you listen good, he said. I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but you're not gonna touch them. Not Nicole. Not Leah. Not on my watch. The driver grinned, unfazed. You don't get it, do you? This ain't personal. It's just business. Luke's blood turned to ice. These men weren't just coming for revenge. They wanted to send a message. And they didn't care who got caught in the crossfire. Drive away, Luke growled. And don't come back. The driver chuckled. We'll be seeing you around, officer. And then, just like that, they drove off. Luke stood there for a long moment, his fists clenched, his mind racing. The clock was ticking, and he needed to make his next move fast. The escape plan. Luke burst into Nicole's apartment, his adrenaline pumping. Nicole stood in the kitchen, startled by his sudden entrance. Luke, what's wrong? We need to leave. Now. Her face paled. What happened? Luke didn't sugarcoat it. They were outside, watching. And they weren't just there to scare us. They're planning something. Nicole froze, her hands gripping the counter. Leah peeked out from the hallway, rubbing her tired eyes. Mommy, what's going on? Nicole forced a smile, trying to keep her voice calm. Nothing, baby. Just a little trip, okay? Leah immediately looked at Luke, sensing something more. Is it the bad guys? Luke crouched down in front of her. Not if I have anything to say about it. Leah hesitated, then nodded. He moved to the door, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The wind was cold, cutting against his skin, but his grip on his gun was steady. The men stopped, their weapons glinting under the moonlight. Officer Luke, the leader drawled. We knew you'd be here. Luke raised his gun, his voice deadly calm. You should have stayed away. Silence. Tension. Then, the first man reached for his gun. Luke fired first. The final stand. The night air cracked with the sharp explosion of gunfire. Luke's first shot hit its mark, striking the man in the shoulder before he could even pull his weapon. The intruder let out a strangled cry, stumbling back into the darkness. But the other two weren't hesitating. They moved fast, drawing their weapons, but Luke was faster. Bang! Bang! The second man dropped, clutching his leg as he fell onto the damp forest floor. The last one, the leader, didn't flinch. He just smiled. Not bad, officer, he said, voice eerily calm. But let's not pretend you can take us all down alone. Luke didn't blink. Try me. The leader smirked. You really think you can protect them forever? Luke's grip tightened on his gun. I don't think, he growled. I know. The leader gave a slow, condescending nod. We'll see. Then, before Luke could react, the man bolted into the trees, disappearing into the night. Luke's heartbeat pounded, but he didn't chase him. His instincts screamed that this wasn't over yet. Turning back, he secured the two injured men, kicking their weapons aside before pulling out his radio. Daniels, he barked, his voice sharp. I need units at the safe house. 2 hostiles down, 1 on the run. Daniels' response crackled through immediately. On my way. Luke exhaled. His body was pulsing with adrenaline, but he had no time to process it. He turned and rushed back inside the cabin. The moment of truth. Nicole and Leah were huddled in the bedroom, clutching each other tightly. At the sight of Luke, Nicole's eyes filled with fear and relief. Are you okay? She whispered. Luke gave a firm nod. They're not gonna hurt you. Leah peeked out from under Nicole's arms, her voice small and shaky. Is it over? Luke knelt down, gently taking her tiny hands in his own. Almost, sweetheart, he promised. But I need you to be brave just a little longer. Leah swallowed hard. Okay. Nicole exhaled sharply, brushing Leah's hair back before looking at Luke with raw gratitude. You saved us, she whispered. Luke shook his head. Not yet. But I will. Because this wasn't just about protecting them anymore. It was about ending this nightmare. Forever. The final chase. When backup arrived, Luke didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gun, his badge, and his determination, then went after the last man standing. Daniels tried to stop him. Luke, let the feds handle it. But Luke shook his head. I'm finishing this. The hunt led him deep into the woods. The leader, Marcus Steele, as Luke had later identified, was trying to escape, but Luke had one advantage. He knew these woods better than any criminal. The moment he spotted movement between the trees, Luke struck. He tackled Steele to the ground, sending them both tumbling across the damp earth. Steele fought hard, throwing a wild punch, but Luke dodged, pinning him with sheer force. This is over, Luke growled. Steele spat at the ground, sneering. You think locking me up changes anything? There will always be more of us. Luke's eyes burned with fire. Not for them, he said, his voice like steel. Not for Nicole. Not for Leah. This ends with you. With one final twist, Luke wrenched Steele's arms behind his back, securing the cuffs tight. For the first time, the fight was over. And Luke had won. A new life. The following weeks were a blur of trials, testimonies, and final goodbyes to the life Nicole and Leah had once known. Derek Kane's case was airtight. He would never see the outside of a prison again. Marcus Steele and his gang. Dismantled. Nicole and Leah were finally free. And Luke. For the first time in years, he felt like he had found his purpose again. One evening, as he pulled up to Nicole's new home, a quiet, safe house arranged through witness protection, he found Leah waiting for him on the front porch. Her face lit up when she saw him. Officer Luke. She called, running into his arms. Luke caught her effortlessly, chuckling. Hey, kiddo. Nicole stepped outside, smiling as she watched them. Luke set Leah down, his heart warming at the sight of her happiness. How's the new place? Leah grinned. It's perfect. Mom even made cookies. Nicole rolled her eyes playfully. Burned cookies, she corrected. Luke smirked. Still better than police station coffee. Nicole laughed, the sound lighter than ever before. For the first time, she wasn't scared anymore. She was home. And Luke realized. So was he. The last question. That night, as Luke tucked Leah into bed, she held onto his hand a little longer than usual. Luke, she whispered sleepily. Yeah, sweetheart. She hesitated, then looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. Are you gonna leave someday? Luke felt a deep ache in his chest. He thought about his old life, the empty apartment, the cold, lonely nights. Then he thought about this, about her, about Nicole. And suddenly, the answer was so clear. He pressed a kiss to Leah's forehead. "I'm right where I belong," he whispered. Leah smiled sleepily. "Good." And as she drifted off to sleep, Luke knew. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just protecting someone. He was part of something real, and he would never let go.